Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of MEMO's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thanks for joining us again.
Good to be with you again, Nasim. Thank you for having me.
So, on this week's review, we will be discussing Netanyahu's recent announcement to launch a ground invasion of Rafah. So, we'll be talking to Mouin about that. We'll be asking if Israel is deliberately starving Palestinians, given the number of airdrops that are forced onto the various European countries and the US. We'll also be looking at Biden deciding to sanction settlers. Is it too little, too late? And we'll be discussing also a row in the US following Senator Chuck Schumer, who described Israel as a pariah state. And we'll end our conversation with a discussion about efforts in the US and here in the UK to crack down on pro-Palestinian activism. So let's begin, Moin, with the situation in Gaza. On Thursdays, Israel's military, or Netanyahu said it plans to move displaced Palestinians into humanitarian islands in the middle of the Strip, Gaza Strip, ahead of a planned offensive in Rafah. And Netanyahu himself has announced that the invasion is impending. So, what do you think? In your view, is a ground invasion now inevitable? I mean, there's a lot of concerns in the UK and elsewhere, um, trying to persuade Israel against a ground invasion. But I think it seems inevitable. I mean, what do you think? In your view, do you think a ground invasion is now inevitable in Gaza? I mean, sorry, in
Oh,
Rafah.
yeah. Well, it's a very good question that at this stage I think is somewhat difficult to answer. On the one hand, you have a number of analysts who are looking at the current state of the Israeli military, that it's basically treading water, that it has primarily for economic reasons demobilized a lot of the reservists who were called up in October, that the military is increasingly exhausted and much less capable than it was several months ago, and that it really isn't in a position to launch an offensive against a city that hasn't really been entered yet by the Israeli military, and that therefore this should be seen primarily as a threat or a negotiating tactic, and that Israel will continue to pummel Rafah and its surrounding areas from the air with its air force and bombs and missiles and so on. That's one view. Um, and I should add, there's also the complication, of course, of Rafah being situated adjoining the Egyptian border, and as you mentioned, the not so trivial matter that over 1.5 million Palestinians who have been instructed to seek refuge in Rafah by the Israeli military, who've come from the northern and central regions of the Gaza Strip. It's basically a bloodbath, a guaranteed bloodbath waiting to happen. And I think Israeli proclamations that they are establishing humanitarian islands, whatever those may be, in the central Gaza Strip, which is now being bombarded virtually around the clock, I think those statements can be taken with a grain of salt. So, one view is that the Israeli military really isn't up to the task, that we should see this primarily as a threat that is being made for political purposes to exercise pressure on Hamas and on others in the context of the ceasefire negotiations. Then there's another view that says, while the Israeli military may be weakened and less capable, and at this stage have insufficient manpower and material and so on, nevertheless, Israel is dead set on dealing as heavy a blow to Hamas as it can. And if it doesn't enter Rafah, if it doesn't seize the territory adjoining the Egyptian border, then this entire onslaught that Israel has launched on the Gaza Strip will end up as one massive strategic failure. And so therefore, it is virtually inevitable that Israel either imminently or at a later stage will enter Rafah. The other factor is that for the first time, we're seeing serious noises being made by Israel's Western sponsors, by the United States, by the United Kingdom, today by Germany, by the European Union, and others, warning Israel either not to launch an offensive against Rafah or to only do so once certain prerequisites have been met. I don't think that Israel is taking these warnings particularly seriously because, after all, they're just words. But it'll be interesting that if these Western states begin to be convinced that such an operation is imminent and that such an operation is going to cause them political problems, whether domestically or within the region, whether they will then begin to match their words with actions that would help persuade Israel to change course. That's not something I'm particularly optimistic about, but I do think it is something we need to bear in mind.
We will get to Israel dismissing completely requests by its Western allies not to invade Rafah and many other demands made by Western allies in the US and here in the UK as well. But returning back to one of the goals or aims of the Rafah invasion, you mentioned that it could be really just a political negotiating tactic to force Hamas into a corner. And Hamas has, according to reports, dropped one of its main conditions in the negotiation. Hamas has maintained that, there cannot be a ceasefire without a permanent ceasefire. There cannot be a release of the hostages without a permanent ceasefire. And it seems like it's dropped that condition. So do you think, it's worked, the Israeli tactic of announcing invasion of Rafah, ground invasion of Rafah? Do you think it's worked as a negotiation tactic if Hamas has indeed dropped its main condition, which is that there is no ceasefire, permanent ceasefire without Israeli withdrawal?
Right. Well, Hamas has changed its position, but I don't think that this threat of an invasion of Rafah is a main explanation of that change. First, to review what that change is, Hamas's initial position was that it would not even negotiate about exchange of captives, or for that matter, anything else, unless and until there was a permanent cessation of hostilities, a full withdrawal of Israeli forces to the 6 October positions, and that displaced Palestinians, particularly from the north of the Gaza Strip, would be allowed to return to their homes, and so on. It then began negotiating about various formulas, but stuck to the principle that it would not accept any agreement that did not, from the outset, allow for a permanent cessation of hostilities and these other conditions I've just mentioned and a few others. Its position now appears to be that it will accept a phased ceasefire in which any agreement would be divided into 3 installments of, I believe it's 42 or 45 days, but that after the first phase, it would only meet its commitments that it would undertake for the second phase if that was packaged as part of a permanent ceasefire. So it's basically, on the one hand, achieving a commitment for a permanent ceasefire, but its implementation, or its acknowledgement, if you will be delayed until after the first 45 days of any new agreement. So on the one hand, it comes down to basically the same thing. On the other hand, I think it does represent a change of position by Hamas, in the sense that it's not it's no longer insisting that it achieves all its objectives, either at the very outset of any agreement or as part and parcel of any agreement. Now, according to the Israeli press, there are divisions within Israel about this agreement, and it seems that a very substantial number of Israeli leaders believe that Hamas's demands, on the whole, are ones that Israel can accept, particularly if it leads to the release of all remaining Israeli captives in the Gaza Strip and the bodies of those that have been killed during the Israeli bombings of the past months. But there are two sticking points. The first is that, interestingly enough, those who in principle support such an agreement, their strongest objection is neither to a permanent cessation of hostilities nor to a full Israeli withdrawal to the 6 October boundaries, but rather to Hamas's demand that all Palestinians from the northern Gaza Strip, without distinction, be allowed to return to their homes in the northern Gaza Strip, because the Israeli position is that women and children and the elderly will be allowed to return, but that men of military age, which I think is those between 18 and 45 or something along those lines, would be prevented from returning to the northern Gaza Strip, and this for Hamas is a non-starter. So we'll have to see how it plays out, because the other position in Israel, which is represented most prominently by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I believe not him alone, is to reject any agreement as a matter of principle for two reasons. The first is to avoid being seen to accept demands that have been put forward by Hamas that had not been initially offered by Israel. So it's a kind of saving face position of, we won this war, we destroyed Hamas, so we're certainly not going to accept anything that this organization imposes on us. The second reason is that they want to continue with this campaign and indeed, as we were discussing previously, invade Rafah and seek to degrade the Hamas military presence there. And the third, which is an issue that people constantly raise, but I think is probably less significant than it's been made out to be, is this idea that Netanyahu needs to keep the war going in order to ensure his political survival. Where I think it does matter is that whether he chooses to move forward and accept an agreement that also represents a change of Israeli position, or whether he rejects any agreement, will affect his coalition. You have the fascist right, which is likely to bolt his coalition if he reaches any agreement about anything. And then you have other forces, particularly those in the war cabinet who were associated with the security establishment, who may leave the coalition if it rejects any agreement on principle, both because on the one hand they feel that these would represent achievements for Israel, and secondly, they don't want to unnecessarily complicate Israeli-American and Israeli-Egyptian and Israeli-Qatari relations.
Sticking to this point, I mean, at this stage of the genocidal assault, I think it's worth asking, what do you think Israel will try and present as a reason for claiming victory? And also Hamas, what can Hamas point to and show the Palestinians we've achieved victory? Or is the fact that Hamas attacked Israel on 7 October in the manner it did, that in itself is a victory? Or is it seeking something more than that to show to the Palestinians, what we've achieved is an enormous victory, and we've defeated Israel in this manner, in this way. And what can Israel show as an example of a victory against Hamas? Because everyone knows it's not going to defeat Hamas completely. What can
Yes.
it show as an indication that it has emerged victorious?
Well, let's start with Hamas. Irrespective of what has happened since the 7th of October, and irrespective of the ultimate results and outcome of this war and the genocidal assault and all the rest of it, Hamas has, by a virtually unanimous consensus of Israeli politicians and analysts and opinion makers, delivered the most devastating blow to Israel since the 1948 war. In other words, during its entire 75-year existence, whether in terms of the total number of casualties, whether in terms of the territory that Hamas seized, which for the first time in Israel's history was, well, with a very minor exception on the Golan Heights, was within Israel's boundaries rather than, as in 1973, in occupied Arab territory. And also, while the focus, particularly in the Western media, has mainly been on attacks on civilians and atrocities and so on, they did knock out some very high-profile military and some very sensitive intelligence targets on October 7th. So, irrespective of how this turns out in the end, um, that is not something that can be erased. At the same time, I don't think that is going to be enough for Hamas to claim either a victory or that the price that Palestinians, not just Hamas, but the Palestinians have had to pay um, has in any sense been worth it. I think in order to do that, we have to look at the larger objective of Hamas, which in my view was to irrevocably shatter the status quo, put the Palestinian question back front and center on the international agenda, and propel it forward so that there is real change on the ground and real change in Palestinian lives. Well, you could argue there has been real change for far too many Palestinian lives, particularly in the Gaza Strip. But the point being that Palestinians are no longer, as they have been in recent years, um, uh, an issue and a people that can be safely ignored while the West continues to sponsor these Arab-Israeli normalization deals and so on. So the political dispensation that takes hold in the coming months and years, if any indeed does, that will be an important marker. The second, I think, is that Hamas has to clearly demonstrate that it was in this not only for itself as an organization, but also acted on the basis of achievements, of seeking achievements for the Palestinian national movement as a whole and for the Palestinian people as a whole. And here I think the outcome of the prisoner exchange, the exchange of captives, becomes absolutely key. If Hamas only manages to free its own prisoners and its own high-profile prisoners, then I think the image will take root, excuse me, quite justifiably, that Hamas was in this for itself and was in this only to free its own prisoners from the Israeli gulag. Alternatively, if Israel succeeds in freeing prominent leaders of other organizations, and I'm thinking of Marwan Barghouti of the Fatah movement, Ahmed Saadat of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and others, that will help it to present itself as acting in the national rather than factional interest, and will also, I think, strengthen its hand to reach accommodations and agreements with other Palestinian factions that it has not been able to do thus far. So that it's a kind of a sketch of where I think things stand for Hamas. For Israel, I think the equation is a little different because on the one hand, Israel has consistently, from the outset, identified the destruction of Hamas as its war objective. As you've noted, there's now a fairly broad consensus that that is not something that was or is attainable. But I think the extent to which Israel manages to degrade Hamas as an organization, as a military structure, that will be one indication. You know, will Hamas be driven entirely underground and limited to the occasional attack with hand grenades and Kalashnikovs, or will it be able to begin once again, deploying military force along the lines of what it has in recent conflicts? And I think the key issue, given that the Israeli leadership has so personalized this war, a key issue is whether it manages to assassinate and take out key Hamas leaders. Thus far, the only one that it has managed to eliminate has been Salah al-Aruri in Beirut. He was the deputy Politburo leader of Hamas, but he wasn't in the Gaza Strip. And among those in the Gaza Strip, thus far, they haven't managed to eliminate any of the top leaderships. The Israelis are now claiming that they may have successfully targeted the deputy commander of the Qassam brigades at the Gaza Strip, Marwan Isa, who's seen as the third most senior figure of the organization in the territory, but it's entirely unclear whether that succeeded. And of course, for them, the big targets are, of course, Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and Mohammed Dif, who is the commander of the Qassam brigades, both of whom have previously eluded Israeli assassination attempts. So I think that's one aspect for Israel. Whether also their own citizens who have evacuated from the Gaza envelope at the beginning of the conflict because Hamas was intensively bombarding them with missiles and mortars, whether those people feel secure enough and have sufficient confidence in the Israeli military to move back en masse to these population centers from where they evacuated. But I think there's also another component here, is that given the level of dehumanizing vitriol and delegitimization and so on of the Palestinians as a people, and the extent to which this has been absorbed and embraced within Israeli society, there really is now this kind of almost consensus, you could say, that these aren't human beings, these are animals, and we have to either wipe them out or get rid of them. And I think if at the end of the day, Israel does not succeed in either driving the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip or making the Gaza Strip so unfit for human habitation that a very significant majority of Palestinians in that area begin to leave to wherever. If Palestinians are able to undertake a successful process of reconstruction or simply prove their staying power, then I think that will be a significant setback for Israel. And here, it could be a lose-lose situation. Palestinians are experiencing genocide. The Gaza Strip has, in very large part, been razed to the ground. But if Palestinians are still standing on their feet as a society at the end, I think that will be considered a defeat for Israel as well. And if I can, one last point is the form of governance, if there is indeed going to be one, that emerges in the Gaza Strip. Is this a form of governance that will be dictated by Israel and its Western sponsors, regardless of the differences that we've seen between Israel and Washington and so on? But who will choose and appoint and select these people? Will it be Israel and the West, or will it be the Palestinians in a process that is determined by Palestinians themselves? And that's, I think, a third key issue we need to keep our eyes on.
Mm. Turning to your point about Israel being in a lose-lose position, I think when you look at this, there seems to be two audiences Israel is having to play to. First is the domestic audience, who, as you mentioned, they've been indoctrinated so much, nothing less than the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza will be seen as a victory. And on the other hand, Israel has told its Western audience that the goal is to destroy Hamas. Again, most analysts will say that's an unachievable goal. There's no way you can destroy Hamas, or at least the ideology of resisting Israeli occupation. So, I mean, in both cases, it seems like it's backs against the corner in terms of, what is achievable as a victory. And that's why I think you're seeing articles now, even in the Washington Post, saying things like Israel's between a rock and a hard place, and Israel's trying to solve a crisis of its own making. And there's a sense and a realization that, the goals with which Israel went into this genocidal campaign is completely unattainable, domestically and also to the Western audience. And you're seeing that more and more, especially in the condemnation. I mean, you had, I think, Biden last week or the week before, he said Rafah, invasion of Rafah was a red line. But we don't know what he meant by that. But the fact that he said there was a red line, and then he rolled back on that. And then last week, Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, he came out and said that Israel is starving Palestinians and using starvation as a tool of war.
Yes.
And that's quite a shocking indictment of Israel, and he said there's evidence Israel is preventing food aid, humanitarian aid into Gaza. So on this point, because there is more and more EU and American officials saying that Israel is now, there's a realization Israel is intentionally blocking humanitarian aid, which is why you're seeing the airdrops from various different countries. I mean, what would you specifically point to as evidence that Israel is deliberately using, starvation as a weapon of war and preventing humanitarian aid from entering into Gaza?
Well, you have this bizarre situation within Israel where on the one hand, Israelis insist, not just for propaganda purposes, I sense that many of them genuinely believe this. On the one hand, they insist that the Israeli military is the most moral army in the world. Never has there been such a moral army throughout recorded history. And at the same time, that they have an absolute right to starve the population of the Gaza Strip into submission, to engage in mass killings, to engage in ethnic cleansing, and if necessary, to basically exterminate the brutes. And these two ideas seem to coexist quite comfortably with each other in the Israeli mind these days. As far as the evidence, well, look at what Israel's best friends are saying. The foreign policy chief of the European Union is openly, publicly, not behind closed doors, stating that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. Look at the volume of aid that is getting through. It decreased very significantly after the International Court of Justice on the 26th of January ordered Israel not to interfere with such supplies. Look at the statements made quite deliberately by Israeli leaders. There will be no water, no food, no medicine, no power, nothing. And going out of their way to say that they will make no distinction between civilians and combatants. So I think the record there is very clear, whether it comes to words, statements by Israeli leaders themselves, encouragement to do so by prominent Israeli journalists and opinion makers, and now also best-selling singers, with a best-selling pop hit about "Burn Them to the Ground" or whatever it is. So on the one hand, what the Israelis themselves are saying and doing. On the other hand, what international organizations who are on the ground or trying to get on the ground are saying about reality. And last but by no means least, what Israel's own sponsors in the West are increasingly saying. But I have to say, regarding this last category, don't pay too much attention. I mean, don't read too much into what they say in the sense of seeing this as a harbinger of a significant policy change. The Europeans are past masters at condemning the things they support. What they say is meaningless when policy and action point in exactly the opposite direction. Blinken can whine all he wants about the urgent need to get more humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. But when the primary aid he is, between quotes, he's giving to the Gaza Strip is thousands of tons of high explosives sent to Israel without congressional review, which are then used to exterminate entire families in the Gaza Strip, I think that kind of gives the game away. So, talk is cheap, focus on reality and actions. And in this sense, I mean, every analyst, specialist, international aid organization, and so on, without exception, have said with varying forms of politeness that these airdrops are basically performative theater, that they're a drop in the bucket, that this issue cannot be significantly addressed, let alone resolved, either through airdrops, which are now also killing people with what appear to be expired food packages, or even by this port that the Americans are apparently floating port off the coast of Gaza, that without opening the land routes, without allowing all the aid that is simply waiting to enter the Gaza Strip to get in, this crisis, this emergency, this incipient famine cannot be addressed. And the level of Israeli mendacity and dishonesty is really breathtaking. We had just this week a British conservative member of parliament, I unfortunately forget her name, who it was explained to her in much detail by Elon Levy, one of Israel's chief propagandists during this genocide, that actually no aid is getting into the Gaza Strip on Saturdays because the United Nations had requested the Israelis not to open the crossings on Saturday. So apparently now, it's the United Nations that considers the Jewish Sabbath sacred. And she asked him for the receipts, and he kept coming up with one excuse after the other. And she said, okay, you have to either provide evidence or retract your statement. And of course, he did neither.
Talking about the United Nations, last week, a number of other Western countries, I think Canada, Australia, have resumed funding to UNRWA. I think only US and UK are the last two remaining countries.
Maybe Germany as well, if I'm
Maybe
not
Germany, yes. So, yes. So far there's been no evidence to for the allegations Israel used uh, to make the claim that
Or will there
Palestinian.
be?
Yeah, there will be. I mean, let's returning to your point about performative theater. There was also an announcement last week that the US Treasury will impose sanctions on a number of illegal settlers. The American Ministry of Finance also announced the imposition of sanctions against several settlers due to their involvement in the attack. And to a lot of people, that seems too little too late. Is that also a part of the performative theater or
Oh,
managing anger
absolutely.
and frustration that is out there, not just in the US, but also across the world at US inability to do anything? Do you also see that as
Oh,
a
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's not dealing with the symptom rather than the cause. It's dealing with the symptom by pretending the cause doesn't exist. You know, settlement is a state policy. Settlement is not some vigilante initiative that is being carried out by secret cells who are opposed to the state and are being pursued by the state. The settlers are the armed vanguard of state policy. They're essentially auxiliary militias of the Israeli state implementing its policy of territorial expansion and ethnic cleansing. And to somehow go after these foot soldiers while pretending their commanders and political leaders don't exist is absolutely absurd. It's like giving a mafia hitman a life sentence by cutting a deal with the Don. It makes absolutely no sense. It's pure theater. It's meant to impress those who see pictures of these settler-initiated pogroms in Hawara and other places in the West Bank, but perhaps don't have a sufficient understanding of the relationship between the settlers and state policy, and for that matter, Western policy, where these extremists, violent terrorists, can in fact obtain tax-free charitable donations from their sponsors, the American taxpayer, and I believe there are similar arrangements in Europe. So, you know, you allow your citizens to fund these people or these organizations that sponsor these people, that sponsor these settlements. You yourself are the greatest defender of the state and the impunity of its settlement enterprise. And then you go and sanction a few Israeli settlers while taking no measures against settlers who are American citizens or French citizens, who those two, the American and French settlers, tend to be among the most violent and lawless, even compared to their Israeli counterparts. So it really it's pure theater, which will do nothing to change reality on the ground. I mean, you can perhaps look at it as a shot across the bow that may make
so to add to that, I think if the US adopted a policy like that of sanctioning settlers in the beginning of the Oslo Accords in the 90s, it would have
exactly.
made sense. We want to preserve the two-state solution, and therefore anyone who undermines the goal of a two-state solution, we will impose sanctions on them. So 30 years ago, it would have made perfect sense. But now the frame of reference has completely changed. But for whatever reason, we know what the
Yes,
reasons are.
but even that, I mean, of course, the U.S. did impose this whole slew of sanctions, but they were all against Palestinians or others, never against Israelis. But even then, if I take the question on the if I take it on the grounds that it was posed, even then I think it would have had limited effect because it would have only gone after some of these crazies. But when the Netanyahu government in 1996 established a brand new settlement on Jebel Abu Ghneim, which it named Har Homa, that wouldn't have been sanctioned because that was the Israeli state. And the establishment of that new settlement, which was explicitly designed to sever the connection between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, um, that was given a pass. American diplomatic efforts were initially focused on trying to dissuade uh, the Israeli government from moving forward, but when it saw that the Israeli government was determined to move forward, reverted to traditional US policy, which is that irrespective of what Israel does, it has impunity and can never be and can never face consequences for its crimes. And all the pressure began to be on the Palestinians to accept what Israel was doing and to minimize their opposition to the settlement expansion and even the establishment of new settlements.
So what's clear, I mean, is that the US, they've been willfully blind to the fact that the two-state formula is completely dead, and there's a new reality on the ground, which is the creation of a greater Israel, and that's what seems to be uh, the case. And Western countries don't seem to be able to change their approach towards that reality, the fact that Israel is no longer moving towards any kind of two-state scenario, but moving towards a one-state reality. And America, London, Germany are refusing to accept that reality, which is why you see these performative, uh, you know, actions like airdrops, like imposing sanctions on settlers, because it's completely disconnected to reality. And the reality on the ground, as every single human rights group has said, is that there is only one state between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, which is the Jewish Israeli state. And they're the only power in that territory, historic Palestine. And that's a reality which they've not, for whatever reason, have not acknowledged and changed their attitudes and the policy accordingly. So
Well, sorry, go ahead.
so that's an underlying problem which
Mm.
they don't seem to get their head around and are incapable of dealing with.
Well, it's very difficult for them to acknowledge a one-state reality that every major human rights organization has characterized as an apartheid regime, and that the leading Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, has characterized as a regime of Jewish supremacy from the river to the sea. That kind of entity from the river to the sea is something that these Western states seem entirely comfortable with, and no one gets denounced or criminalized or demonized or delegitimized for supporting it. They can't publicly acknowledge it, I think, for quite clear reasons. But in practice, they have either acquiesced in it or are actively supporting it in various ways. So you look at the European Union, for example, which is often seen as the most vocal opponent of this one-state reality. Well, it happens to be the largest and most important export market for illegal settlement products. It's not the United States, it's the European Union. And so they will not do anything about it. Israel's impunity is a foundational principle of the Western designed rules-based international order. It's simply not allowed and is not going to happen. But regarding what you said about the two-state settlement, yes, it is true that Israel has been on a mission to make it impossible. But at the same time, I think it is also true that if the Western powers mustered sufficient political will, it would take very little effort for them to compel Israel to withdraw to the 1967 boundaries. I mean, one thing we've learned during this crisis is the extraordinary level of Israeli dependence, militarily, politically, diplomatically, on the West and particularly on the United States, which also means that these states have an extraordinary level of leverage over Israel. The issue is that they appear to have taken a principled strategic decision that they will use their leverage only against Palestinians, only against Arabs, but not against Israel. And in fact, If we look at what had been happening in recent years, the primary item on the American and European agenda was um, obtaining a halal certificate for Greater Israel by promoting and celebrating even these Arab-Israeli normalization agreements that were not designed to uh, promote Israeli-Palestinian peace or Palestinian self-determination, but were explicitly designed by Israel to marginalize the Palestinians and prevent Palestinian self-determination. And that's why I refer to these as halal certificates for Greater Israel for precisely the kind of apartheid regime that we've been discussing.
Let's turn our attention to three major developments last week on the international stage. Democrat Senator Chuck Schumer, he gave a powerful presentation address at the Congress describing Israel as Israel is becoming a pariah state. These are the words he used. And he called for elections in Israel to remove Netanyahu. He believes Netanyahu is bad for Israel. And Israel cannot survive, he said, as a pariah state. That's quite shocking for someone who spent all his life in Congress supporting Israel.
Say the
Uh,
least.
yeah, so how significant is this moment in your view? A staunch supporter like Chuck Schumer using words like pariah in reference to Israel?
Well, as you mentioned, I mean, not only has Chuck Schumer been a lifelong passionate advocate for Israel, he's been one of the most extremist um, supporters of Israel in the U.S. Political system. I mean, there's nothing he won't endorse or sponsor. He voted against the Iranian nuclear agreement. You look at his position, and they're really off the rails. And now all of a sudden, he's denouncing Netanyahu in his words in a subsequent interview. I wanted to make it clear you can be both pro-Israel and anti-Netanyahu. I have to say, I had several different reactions when I first learned of Schumer's outburst. The first is, this is typical American arrogance, telling other countries when to have their elections, how to have their elections, who their leaders should be. I mean, we see this all over the world. And then I thought, you know what? It's an American proxy. The Americans paid for it. So in a sense, they have every right to tell this client state what to do. But then there's also, I think, another aspect, and it bears recollection that Israel is constitutionally not the state of the Israeli people, meaning those citizens who hold and carry Israeli passports. Israel constitutionally defines itself as the state of the Jewish people. In other words, it is the state of Jews everywhere. Well, Schumer is the most prominent Jewish politician in the United States. So by Israel's own standards and criteria, um, Schumer has every right to engage in political debate in a state that I'm sure he considers the state of the Jewish people as well, and that Israel itself defines that as uh, the state of the Jewish people. But instead, you've had all these reactions of, stay out of our business. It's none of your business. You have no right to tell us what to do. So, well, which is it? Are
Mm.
you, but I think also that many people viewed Schumer as kind of a stalking horse for Biden. I'm not sure to what extent that's true, that this was somehow coordinated with the White House as part of a way, part of a let's say initiative by the White House to make its displeasure with Biden known. If it was, it's rather cowardly. I mean, Biden can't get up and say the same forceful things about Netanyahu, which would have an immediate impact. He instead has to rely on Schumer to make these statements. But having said that, um, I do think that Schumer making these statements will make it much easier for other Congress people who haven't yet spoken out, but are increasingly disturbed, if not disgusted, by what's going on to now, if the most fanatic pro-Israeli politician in Congress says these things, well, then surely it's legitimate for others to be doing so as well.
I think what's interesting is the fact that someone like Schumer said Israel cannot survive as a pariah state. He's talking in the future tense. For a lot of people, Israel has become a pariah state,
Yeah.
and
Get with the
that's
program.
interesting. Yeah, yeah, and that's interesting mainly because it shows where Israel's legitimacy lies. It lies in the West as a a democracy in the Middle East.
The
And
only
if that,
democracy in the
yeah,
Middle East.
only democracy in the Middle East, and if that image of Israel is destroyed and Israel becomes a pariah state, Saudi can exist as a pariah state. UAE can survive as a pariah state. All the other Arab countries can survive as a pariah state. Russia can survive as a pariah state. But Israel surviving as a pariah state, because it relies so much on Western support, I think is a very tall order. And that's what I think
Yes,
Schumer
yeah.
knows that, and that's the concern. And he's talking the future tense when we all know that Israel is a pariah state and it becoming more and more so, and its existence and survival as a pariah state is threatened.
Well, this is another example where you get a prominent American or Western politician, thinking the globe ends at the boundaries of the West, as you rightly point out. Israel globally is a pariah state. It's just it's not considered a pariah by its Western sponsors. And so what they mean is, it's only when you become a pariah in our part of the world that it really begins to matter. But I think you made a very important observation. I mean, take Saudi Arabia. Much of the U.S. public holds the House of Saud in contempt. But that has never had an impact on U.S.-Saudi relations. I think Israel here is I'm not sure if unique is the right word, but certainly appears to be in a class by itself, which is that Israel derives a significant amount of its power from what had been widespread public support for Israel, the myths about Israel, the illusions about its policies and its character, and so on. And I would argue its most important strategic asset has been the bipartisan support that it has enjoyed in the U.S. Congress, and I think to a large extent among the U.S. public as well. And I suspect Schumer is seeing that on the one hand, Israel or Israeli governments have increasingly been aligning themselves, not with the mainstream, not with even the mainstream of the American Jewish community, but have increasingly chosen for polarization, aligning themselves with radical evangelicals, with radical MAGA types, almost feeling that they can safely neglect the center and certainly the left, which they've written off long ago, even though what passes for the left within the US congressional spectrum had traditionally been arguably the most solid base of support for Israel.
Let's end on this question, which is the crackdown on pro-Palestinian activism in the US and UK, and that's happening in two different forms. In the US, there's an attempt to ban TikTok. Currently, there's a bill that's going through Congress to banned TikTok, and that's partly because, from what I see, TikTok has been a major platform for showing pro-Palestinian support. And if you look at the numbers, there's 40 times more pro-Palestinian support and solidarity with Palestinians on TikTok than with Israel. And I think that's triggered something in the US, which is why there's a push to ban TikTok and desire to maintain control over social media in the US. In the UK, you have something similar where our one of our ministers, Michael Gove, uh, you know, um, issued a new definition of extremism, and this new definition will basically criminalize pro-Palestinian activists, number of Muslim organizations, and that I think both of these developments is a recognition, or as a result of an awareness that Israel's losing the battle for hearts and minds, which of course makes it more and more difficult for Western regimes to support Israel, um, especially if Israel becomes a pariah state. So, what do you make of these developments? They didn't simply come out of nowhere, especially
Yeah.
with TikTok. Seems to be a real desperation to take back control of social media platforms, especially because they are demonstrating solidarity with the Palestinians in much higher and more significant way than you see support for Israel on those platforms.
Yes, I mean, if you're losing hearts and minds, well, then you blindfold them, plug their ears, and take legislative measures to declare them beyond the pale, as Michael Gove is now doing. I'm not going to pretend to understand the world of technology and TikTok and all the rest of it, but I have seen others make the assertion that if everything that critics of TikTok have been saying for years is true, then isn't it curious that it is coincidentally now, when TikTok has been playing this important role in mobilizing support for Palestinian rights and in educating younger people about the question of Palestine, that all of a sudden it needs to be urgently banned. Um, I think that makes sense to me. As far as Michael Gove is concerned, I mean, as fanatically pro-Israel agenda is hardly a new development, and he's performing a service. But again, as I think you suggested, this shows that Israel has lost the plot. Israel is no longer in control of the narrative. The information landscape has become too diffuse to be dictated. And the New York Times and the BBC and the Guardian and these other major news organizations may still use what Lale Khalili calls the passive exonerative, where Palestinians die without ever identifying either that they were killed or who's responsible for their killing. Well, you can't really police that systematically, not only in the mainstream media, but also in alternative media, on social media. I think the landscape has become too diffuse to be controlled in this way. And so what if you can't get your message out, well, then shoot the messenger. And I think that's what we're seeing here on the one hand. And on the other is there is this very serious development of not only seeking to censor media, to prevent people having free access to information, but also criminalizing um, uh, solidarity activities and perfectly legitimate, peaceful activities by declaring them to be beyond the pale, extremists, terrorists, and so on.
I think the wider question here is, if the Anglosphere generally, who have supported Israel throughout the decades, if they will have to abandon some of their liberal democratic principles and adopt
Oh,
authoritarian tools, if they are to maintain and continue supporting Israel, there seems to be no other way. They have to almost become authoritarian if
And
they
they're
are
doing,
to. And
and
and sorry, go on.
no, I was going to say, yes, and they're doing it, and we've seen this already with all this anti-BDS legislation and so on. And I would just point out, yes, this is directed specifically at Palestinians, but not only Palestinians. I mean, Lyra Friedman of the Foundation for Middle East Peace in the United States and others have pointed out that Palestinians and their rights are the canaries in the coal mine, the guinea pigs for what you rightly characterize as these authoritarian repressive measures. Because once these laws are on the books, once these practices become routine and legitimate, they're not only going to be used against Palestinians and their supporters. We've already seen in the United States, you know, they're used against advocates of reproductive rights. They can be used in all kinds of different settings, because there's nothing about these laws and these measures that says it's illegal to use them against anything other than Palestinians and their rights. They can be deployed across the board, and particularly now with the increasingly likely prospect that Trump will again reside in the White House. Well, you know, you adopt these agendas at your peril.
Thank you, Mouin. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, and thank you for tuning in. See you next week for another episode of Memo's Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my guest, Mouin Rabbani.
Thank you.